The opinions and assertions expressed herein are those of the author and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences or the Department of Defense.
Welcome back, everyone, to Curing the Curriculum. We hope you had a great summer. Today's episode is a very special one for me because we're joined by someone whose work has reshaped how I think about my place in medicine. Dr. Tasha Wyatt is Vice Chair for Research and Deputy Director of the Center for Health Professions Education at the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, Maryland. Her work examines how systems of power shape professional identity, especially for those underrepresented, and how we can respond to injustices through professional resistance. Reading her paper with the quote, "Those darn kids," in the title genuinely changed my life as a medical student. It helped me understand not only how resistance is often dismissed, but also how it can be done professionally and why it is ethical to resist. And that's why I'm incredibly honored to welcome her on the podcast today. Professional resistance describes the principles that professionals should follow when responding to social harm and injustices. In medical education, this means balancing our role as learners with our responsibility to speak up, even when doing so feels risky. So, how do we challenge systems? And how can we resist professionally without getting dismissed as those darn kids? Let's get into it. Let's start with a question that doesn't have to do with the research right away. So when you were a child, what did you want to become when you grew up?
I was a very strange child because I really wanted to be a researcher when I grew up. I was in a hippie family that didn't really value going to college or becoming book learned. It was much more about living in your environment and becoming very familiar with what's around you. So not having that kind of support, I did all kinds of experiments in my bedroom. I grew mold in different kinds of food groups to try to figure out where mold grows the fastest. I had plants that were growing. I did social science experiments around personal space, things like that. But I just could not think about having any other kind of job other than exploring the natural world.
Wonderful that you already knew so early you wanted to become a researcher and that you experimented so much as a child. But right now you're not really studying molds, you're studying professional resistance and other wonderful things in medical education. So how did that then come about?
Yes. So I started studying more of the social sciences when I went into my PhD, which is in educational psychology. And I studied the cultural compatibility of different educational models with Native Hawaiians. I grew up in Hawaii, and Native Hawaiians were not being well served by the public education system at that point. And so we began to study different models to see what worked, what strategies worked, what pedagogical models were best. And then I really fell in love with the social sciences, and that started my career in the education field. I didn't come into medical education until 2015. So it's been about 10 years. And since then, I've been studying various aspects of racially minoritized physicians in the system.
Well, wonderful that you're doing that and that you have arrived here. So did your background and growing up in Hawaii then already sort of influence you and shape you in that area, or is this something you just stumbled across in medicine?
So in Hawaii in the 1970s and 80s, when I grew up, the Native Hawaiians were going through a major cultural revolution, and they were trying to bring back the Native Hawaiian culture, language, and history into the public schools. I just happened to have teachers that were really strong in the movement. And so I got inculcated with these ideas of resisting a colonial environment. there was an illegal overthrow of the Native Hawaiians that we were taught about and we were told to carry forth in the kinds of work that we do. So, not only was this part of my formal educational system in terms of thinking about resistance, but all of the elders in the community where I grew up were also engaged in resistance. And even though this was not a profession, it was very much part of their identity and the work that they did on a daily basis. And like professional resistance, they had a body of standards and expectations that they had to adhere to. These just happened to be passed down through elders and generations. So previous generations wanted the Native Hawaiian culture to live on. And so they were very much connected to that. And so I got this incredible model around professional resistance. And in that case, it was resistance in your profession, in your personal life, all about maintaining the Hawaiian culture. And so I took that idea and brought it into medical education. And so that's how I actually got started in this topic. When I really noticed it in med ed was around 2017 and 18 with Black and African American physicians. I saw that as participation was widening in our medical schools, more and more Black African American physicians were coming in. And I saw that they had the same integrated identity that I had noted growing up in the Native Hawaiians. And they too were thinking about their ancestors and future generations and making sure that the profession was accessible to them. Native Hawaiians, it was their relationship to the land and the water and these resources. But for them, it was making sure that they could be doctors. And so I drew parallels between the two communities and then began studying it in the trainees there at the Medical College of Georgia, where I started out.
Interesting to also hear the historic aspect of it all. So what are some of these parallels you found? What are the concepts behind professional resistance, the things you find over and over again?
Yeah, so there is a continuation of sort of temporality. So there's a deep connection to the past and historical roots and various forms of social harm and injustice that's been perpetrated on behalf of both groups. In Hawaii, it was colonialism that you can still see remnants of today. And in the Black and African American culture, it's slavery. You still feel it. It's very palpable in the United States, even though it's been, outlawed for centuries. But not only this historical perspective, but looking to the future and the future generation to make sure that they can continue to exist, that these communities have their ways of being and ways of knowing and ways of seeing the world that last much longer than they themselves are alive. And so I see that thread coming through very, very clearly. The other thing that I see are these everyday acts of resistance. So forms that don't necessarily challenge authority, but definitely trying to undermine it, but go without being detected. So in medicine, this might look like humor and sarcasm, non-compliance, non-conformity. In the Native Hawaiian culture, it might come through in stories that are being told to illustrate how one interacts with the land and the water. But in each case, it's ways of shaping those around them to do what is right by the Black community and the Indigenous community.
So am I right then in assuming it's about nudging the people surrounding you with your background and what you have learned? Or is it really, does it go further than that?
So it can go further than that. So the everyday forms of resistance are really good when the risk is too high to confront authority. And so there is also other forms of professional resistance, which can come in the form of marches and riots and protests, these sorts of things that are loud and extraordinary. And they can be professional, they can also be unprofessional, sort of depends on why they're performing these acts. But I've seen both. So in the United States, we had the Black Lives Matter protests that many physicians and trainees participated in. And in Hawaii, there's been lots of marches and protests around, say, development of land that's sacred or water rights that are being pulled away for tourism and new hotels rather than going into traditional farming areas with traditional crops. So I've seen both. But trainees, at least in the medical education context, tend to stay more within the everyday forms, just so that they can fly under the radar and continue to resist.
And listening to this, I assume that every student probably has a chance to act out professional resistance with their own unique background and cultural context, right? Because not everyone might have the same background someone growing up in the US or in Hawaii might have. I assume this is a worldwide phenomenon in medical schools.
For sure. So every group and oftentimes every individual does it a little bit differently, but it is informed by their culture and their community. It might be informed by the level of commitment that they have, their identity as a professional, and how they want to be seen. So there's lots of factors that play into this, but it certainly does come from a place that reflects something that is familiar, because when you're resisting, you're kind of going out on a limb and making yourself vulnerable. So someone who resists, a resistor, will bring forth aspects of themselves as a way to stay sort of centered and secure in something that is known. So they'll use different forms that would be maybe acceptable in their home community.
Interesting. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that, because I think if I were to bring out certain aspects of myself more, I could also make myself more attackable, let's say.
Mm. Oh, yeah, sure. I can give you an example. Yeah. So I do research on this. So these aren't just examples that I'm coming up with at the top of my head, but I've seen both in the Black African American community as well as the Latina community, they will approach their patients not in the way that they've been taught in medical schools, where you have a very professional facade and you interact with them almost like a client. They will draw on sort of more personal, familial ways of interacting. So they often say, my patients remind me of my cousins, my sisters, my aunties, my grandmother, these kinds of things. And they will engage in clinical conversations in ways that put the patient at ease rather than conforming to the standards that or the practices that are very typical in medical education.
So this actually sounds like they're doing it for the good of the patient, the connection with the patient that seems appropriate to their culture. So by just sort of breaking cultural protocol or the standard protocol of how to approach a patient.
Yes, as an example.
And so that is already professional resistance then, but also going on a march. I mean, those are two very probably opposite extremes of how big professional resistance can be. But sort of what makes then professional resistance professional, or what definitions do all of these acts share?
So there are many different types of resistance, and some of them can be professional, some of them are unprofessional. And it's not what the trainee is doing or the individual is doing, it's why they're doing it. So it's the intention behind their actions that really make a difference in terms of deciding whether it's professional or unprofessional. If you are going to engage in professional resistance, you need to adhere to the standards and expectations of the profession. So, example like beneficence and non-malfeasance and justice and things like that we get from bioethics. If you're not adhering to these kinds of standards and you're engaged in resistance that's harming people or isn't for some form of justice or isn't adhering to what we think of as being part of sort of the milieu of the profession, it moves maybe not to unprofessional resistance in the way that we typically think about it in terms of, oh, that person's being unprofessional. But in the fact that it's no longer related to the profession, you move into personal resistance. And that's quite different because you as an individual can resist as a person because you have different beliefs and values and things that you want to forward. But then, if you're going to engage in professional resistance, you need to acknowledge that you are part of a larger community, and that community has some shared principles that you have to adhere to if you're going to try to represent that profession.
So it would be, to make this very black and white, it would be wrong to say I don't like a specialist personally, but it would be good to professionally resist a decision about a patient where you genuinely have a belief about a different treatment being better, for example, because it's then on the professional level.
Yes, as an example. So, for example, I'll give you another one. In the United States and Canada, there's been a lot of different protests around issues in Gaza. That's been a big topic here. Some of the medical trainees say that they're engaged in professional resistance, but what's going on over there isn't necessarily directly related to the profession. They've now moved into personal resistance. So that issue does not, you can make an argument that they're linked, but that's not typically why people are there protesting. But if somebody is protesting, say, the mistreatment of a particular group of patients, and they're representing the profession as a whole, and the need to, say, better create policy or procedures to help that population, that is more professional resistance.
So you already mentioned a little bit that it can be very risky, but I also know that in your work you describe professional resistance, and by your work I mean your research, as necessary, something that's necessary and risky. So how does that go together? Could you maybe explain to us why that is?
Yeah, it is necessary because everybody in our profession has inherited a system that they didn't create. And so that means that it's inherent with the different structural inequalities. And so it's necessary as members of this community, we have a responsibility to bring these forth and to create change because we should not be willing to perpetuate things that are bringing harm to our patients and to our trainees. However, it's very risky to put oneself out on the line and try to challenge, undermine, or push back on various things. There's an extreme risk of retaliation by those that are in positions of power because resistance is illegitimate at this moment. It's considered something often confused with disloyalty or insubordination, disobedience, things like this. But it's in fact not. When somebody is resisting, they in fact care very deeply about the issue, so much so that they're willing to put themselves out there. But here's the catch. When you are engaged in resistance, which I believe is all of our responsibility, you need to do it with proportionality in mind, which means if you see some sort of injustice, let's say around an attending, maybe not giving adequate pain medication to a patient because there's a false belief that the patient can tolerate more pain than, say, a patient from a different racialized group. The correct response for that, the proportional response to that, might be asking a question out of curiosity, such as, I'm a medical student and I'm just trying to learn about pain management. Can you explain to me why we're giving this patient less medication than another patient in the room next door who has the same condition? And inviting the attending, say, to respond to that. That kind of question with curiosity actually goes very far, and it's a strategy I would encourage medical students to use if they're not using it already, because it forces the attending to think about something, a practice or a belief that may be automatic, that they've never consciously put into words for themselves, and they may come to the realization that, in fact, they are discriminating or enacting some sort of a bias. An unproportionate response in that situation might go out and create a campaign to get that doctor fired or starting a protest or a riot. That would be unproportionate to what was witnessed or experienced. And the reason that you want to be proportional is because if you are a resistor in the system, you don't want to get kicked out. If you are retaliated against and you're asked to leave the community, then you lose your ability to continue to resist. And we don't want that. So for those of us who are doing this kind of work, we really underscore the importance of making sure that your resistance is proportionate to the infraction that you perceive to be in front of you.
That very much makes sense. Would I be wrong to call it a game you're playing, trying to find the fine line? Or is it really more about sort of a cost-benefit calculation you're doing?
It's a cost benefit calculation. So when you are deciding how hard to push and whether to push, you need to think about what is your position in the system? Do you have any kind of authority or social capital, power, responsibility? You need to think about who you're interacting with. Is this person have power over you? Can they make decisions that, for example, will dismiss you outside of the profession? Or could they be an ally in supporting you if they agree with sort of your concerns? And then the context that you're in. Are there other people there? Is it appropriate to resist in other people? Will it make somebody feel ashamed or embarrassed? And will that cause some sort of complication? So it's constantly cost benefit analysis, thinking about those three factors, as well as sort of what the future ramifications are. So, questions that I like to ask myself when I'm resisting is, if I resist now, can I resist later, or will I lose my ability to resist? If I resist now, how will that affect my department? How will that look on my boss? Will this jeopardize sort of this next goal that I have? And so you have to constantly think about it in relation to many other things. It's not just an isolated decision that you make in the moment, but you have to think sort of in the future, as well as in the moment and in the past. So if you're constantly resisting, you need to think about the other things that you've resisted and whether this one will be ignored and dismissed, or if this is something that they're going to take seriously because perhaps you've never said anything in the past. Therefore, they're more likely to see this as important.
I very much understand that. But if I then go to a cost-benefit analysis, yes, maybe I inherited a system I didn't create, but I could also choose as a student, for example, I come from a different cultural background where I study, but I could just choose to adopt the local culture, agree with everything, please all my supervisors, and sort of go frictionless through the system, instead of resisting and create loads of friends along the way. Should I do that then?
Yeah, I think everybody has a different moral compass. In some situations, particularly if you're on visas, it's very hard to resist, right? Because the stakes are incredibly high. And so maybe that's not something that you want to do in your training program. But maybe in that case, you kind of put these things in your back pocket to just note to yourself that these are things that you're not going to do in your practice. And that if you're returning to your home country, or if you are in a position of authority, such as you become an attending in the system that you're training in, that you bring awareness to and you help others to sort of challenge themselves. So in that type of situation, it might be too risky. In situations where you cannot live with yourself or the situation because the burden is just too much to bear, then most of those people find that it's very hard to ignore whatever is happening, and they must resist. It also comes down to one's identity as well. So, for example, I was raised Because I was raised in Hawaii during this time and surrounded by people who integrated their resistor identity with all identities, I find it very hard not to speak up and say things. In fact, I'll often say something before I realize that I've said it. And then it's kind of one of those situations where I'm looking over my shoulder, asking myself, who said that? And realizing it was me. So my identity is absolutely integrated on all different levels as a resistor. But others, it's not. Others, they can be professional in professional settings and just be a doctor. And then others, they can be a resistor in different settings and they have no issues with that. So it also, when you resist, also includes sort of your identity and decisions around how you want to show up in the world.
That sounds like a very individual thing, and that also everyone, I guess, develops over their career and the situations they encounter, both professionally but also in their personal lives, probably.
Yes.
Because if I hear it like this, you can apply this to your personal lives, just like you can apply it to the workplace, probably.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You also mentioned earlier insubordination. Where's then the line between that and professional resistance? Is it the proportionality you mentioned, or is there other aspects to insubordination or other sort of less efficient forms of resistance?
So those in positions of authority, more often than not, will look at any form of resistance as insubordination or disobedience or disloyalty or unprofessional. And this is because our system in medical education is built upon these chains of obedience, where we have to obey those above us. And there's good reason for this. It's to keep our patients safe. And this system has been passed down for generations and it's worked. We have physicians who are able to keep patients safe because they listen to those who are older and wiser and have more knowledge. The problem is that this is so inculcated into our system that anytime somebody steps out of that, whether it's to resist or to be creative, it's seen as sort of breaking with these chains. And there's frequently some sort of consequence to it. And so who decides whether it's insubordinate or not is usually those who are in power. What I would like to see happen is when there is, quote, insubordination, what I would love is for somebody in authority that's witnessing this to just take a pause to say, oh, this is interesting. This is a different kind of reaction than we typically see. I wonder what's going on here. And stop and ask the person who seems to be being disobedient what's going on and why they're doing it. Because more often than not, it's some form of social harm or injustice and not something that's directly trying to create a ruckus to make everybody's life miserable. So what I want is more of a curious approach when these kinds of issues come up.
And to maybe go a step further, because you mentioned we inherit systems we don't create, and professional resistance might be seen as insubordination primarily. Why don't we just make that a professional standard, that professional resistance is something good? Or would it then again make it too forced and too protocoled? Does it really need to come from curiosity of the side that holds the power?
So right now, because it's not part of any of the standards and it's not considered legitimate actions in medical education, curiosity is the tool that we have available. I would love to see resistance be incorporated into our professional standards. When I think of professional resistance, it's because the person cares deeply about the profession or aspects of the profession, such as the patient or the trainee who's going through the system. And therefore, it is part of the professional standards and expectations. We treat patients right, and we treat trainees right. If we could get to that point where it's expected and welcomed as something that physicians or all professionals do, I think we can begin to transform the system at a much faster rate, because it's not all the time that's wasted on trying to clean up the aftermath around resistance will be gone. And we can spend that same time in constructively coming up with solutions. But we are definitely not there yet.
No, and I believe I also read a publication that you co-authored about the continuum with patient advocacy. So could you maybe share a little bit with us what that means?
Yeah, resistance and advocacy are on a continuum. So they're not all that different, but they differ in terms of things like scope and risk, these kinds of things. And both are actually really beneficial. And so somebody who's trying to transform the system should have both tools in their pocket. Because sometimes you need to undermine, challenge, or push back on power. Sometimes that is the right response to get something done. And other times you need to just raise awareness and provide support for a particular issue. And that's the right way to go. And again, this all depends on the context, who's present, the kinds of interactions you have, and what your position is, what you're trying to accomplish. All of these kind of contextual factors need to come into play. But if you really want to be sophisticated, using both tools interchangeably would be the best situation.
Interesting, because I think that lens also helps. Even the word advocacy obviously sounds a lot more positive than resistance, which has, I guess, already a slight negative connotation to it.
Mm-hmm.
You said you wish it would be integrated more. As I hear you speak, I also feel like that we should really mentally prepare students for facing such injustices, social injustices, but also clinically speaking, if things go wrong, that they are ready to face these things and maybe professionally resist. Do you have any idea what such a training could look like or should look like in a classroom or in a medical curriculum?
Oh, yes. I would love to do some sort of simulation-based training on this. I think that could be very powerful. So they begin to train in a very safe environment some of these skills. I'm part of two groups who are doing theater of the oppressed, kind of critical pedagogy, training teachers in one case and medical educators in another case to engage in professional resistance. So again, they get to try this out and embody this knowledge. So it's not just sort of something that they've read, but they have some experience with it. I think that we also need to do a lot more role modeling in these spaces. So what I would love to see is attendings, for example, in morning rounds, saying something to their students, such as, today we're going to be rounding on X number of patients. You are likely going to see some aspect of social harm and injustice in the clinical setting. I may be blind to it because I've been in the system for a long time. Some things I may see, some things I might not see. I would invite you to point it out and bring it up for discussion, because what I want to do is to help you get good at identifying it. And then as a team, we'll discuss potential solutions. So bringing out a explicit conversation around these topics and inviting people into the space to discuss them is really important. And then that attending can also practice professional resistance, say with colleagues or sort of interprofessionally. And then when they come back to the group, debrief with them and talk to them about it. This is what I did. Here's how I made my decision. Here was the outcome. So that way it becomes normalized into the profession and not something that's so scary or something that has to be learned on top of all the other clinical knowledge that they need to learn.
And I assume you could apply the same to a traditional classroom where the teacher shares something but opens comments, suggestions, curious questions in the beginning already.
Yes, absolutely. I taught problem-based learning for several years at my previous institution, and my co-facilitator and I did just that. We wanted resistance and we invited resistance in. And it was amazing what the students resisted and how they resisted it. And we were able to give them feedback on their practice of resistance.
So, but what was in it for you then? Because if we come back to the cost-benefit analysis, a clinical supervisor might not really have the time, might not want to deal with students' questions or comments, or feel like they might need to justify them. What are some of the benefits that could actually happen to them if they make themselves, or they open up themselves to feedback and ideas from students?
I think I can answer that in two ways. So the benefits are you, as an attending, let's say, can learn about the social harms and injustices that are in your system. So particularly if you're in a position of power to make decisions, you can help that clinic run more efficiently. You can help your resident team run their clinic much better because they're not having to deal with sort of the issues that come up in daily practice. So I think for you, it creates a level of awareness that's really powerful. I think there's also something about being open to, as a supervisor, somebody that's willing to have conversations and go into those hard places. Medicine has traditionally been taught with just sort of a didactic lecture style, and trainees love when they can interact with their superiors in ways that are just natural conversations. So I think it also brings about greater personal relationships with those that are in the interlocutors that are engaged in these conversations. Oh, shucks. The second one just left my mind. Hopefully it'll come back.
If I remember correctly, you also studied the role of hierarchy in medicine. And in my experience, a lot of departments are very different in that, at least in the Netherlands. Again, probably is different in every country and in every hospital. But have you also seen evidence that these things are different at different departments, different studies? Maybe it's completely different in paramedical fields.
Yes. So every department is very different, and hierarchy does matter, and particularly in acute settings. I just remembered what I was going to say earlier. So, and it's because acute settings, that frame of mind is what cued me back into my previous thought. I think for a really long time, medicine has sort of favored the system and the practices and the procedures that go on in clinical settings. And they've forgotten that medical education, health professions education, healthcare is made up of people. We don't prioritize the people that are in the systems and their well-being. So this is the staff, it's the physicians, it's the trainees, and we will work them to death to make sure that the process is in place and that the system can continue. And I think we need a revolutionary way to rethink this. I think we need to start prioritizing the people in the systems because we're burning out. Suicide rates are high. There's a lot of depression. We have clinical mistakes and various other things. So that is to say, in acute settings, the pressure is really high, and we tend not to think about the people in the room. We tend to think about the patient specifically. And so hierarchy always trumps everything else that's going on. But if you think about an acute setting where risk is high of some sort of accident or poor decision making, I would think that resistance should be welcomed, right? Because you could make the wrong decision because you're just going on autopilot or you're missing something with that patient. And so in acute settings, I don't think resistance is often welcome, but I think we need a paradigm shift around that. And we need to be rethinking it in a very different way. So again, this is a conversation with those who work in those kinds of settings and how resistance might benefit them, and then how to actually enact it in a setting that's safe for the patient, that doesn't bristle and raise eyebrows of those who are actually doing the work.
And there, again, if you're trying to achieve such a thing, I think it's better not to say you're giving the wrong drug, but to ask, why are you giving this drug and not maybe another one or any other form, I guess, right?
Yes.
So what are then other ways to professionally resist? Because you mentioned about doing these trainings with students. What were some of the ways they came up with? Maybe you have some examples and some wonderful ways they reacted.
Yeah. So I think the least risky is to ask questions. So I would definitely encourage people to do that. You can also do other kinds of things. So, if there's an issue that you think is problematic, you can create some sort of a research program and collect data on this issue to demonstrate that it's actually a problem and then present it with a solution. People don't like it when you bring problems to them. They want solutions. So, you could do the back work to help facilitate change. I think you can also do things like, oh, I'm just trying to think of some of the other tactics that they've used. They've created different kinds of journal clubs to bring people together to talk about various issues when their attendings aren't necessarily listening to them, and then come up with strategies as a group that they're going to implement in the clinic as a way to try to nudge change. Social media. So you can start a conversation on social media about this, not naming names or institutions or anything like that, but just raising issues to create an awareness around, something that feels like an injustice. I've also seen students go to their deans and suggest curricular changes and actually create the curriculum or create a community that writes the curriculum. Other ways, I've seen residents go out into the streets with petitions to get signatures from the community around like healthcare decisions. Say a hospital is going to be shut down in the neighborhood, which will disadvantage certain people. I've also seen students start up free clinics where they can provide care for underserved people as a way of circumventing the healthcare system that won't pay attention to certain groups. So there's lots of different tactics that can be used. Some more innocuous than others. So I didn't talk about the ones where people got in trouble. There's certainly those where you disobey direct orders because the orders are unethical, but there's certainly examples of those as well.
Interesting. And in the beginning, we also talked about humor, and that's also one I personally have enjoyed and have used successfully a few times, because I think it's a great vehicle to sort of extrapolate from a situation or make clear how ridiculous it is. But often it needs some time between the actual event that has happened and the time you can make a joke about it.
Yeah, and a joke that gets them to think and reflect on what was done in sort of preparation for changing one's practice is particularly helpful.
Yes. And you mentioned that some students went very far to even change or help create a new version of a curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Was this then just very sort of advanced deans that were welcoming this, or was this also just the students resisting professionally properly? I'm hinting a little bit at a paper you wrote titled Those Darn Kids, or starting with Those Darn Kids, how sometimes the people lower in the chains of obedience get cold, right?
I've seen examples of both. So students sort of running on their own with curricula and bringing it to the administration, particularly when their concerns have been dismissed. I've also seen students being commissioned to write new curriculum because the deans have no idea how to begin doing it. And so you can do both. One is more an act of resistance, and one is more an act of advocacy, as we talked about earlier. In the cases where the students are resisting the curricula and just sort of bringing it to the dean and asking for change, leaders need to understand, again, that there's a concern here, that the students have flagged something that isn't working. And if you're a conscious leader, you would stop and pause and try to figure out what exactly is going on. What isn't working for the students? Is it just this student? Are there other students? What is the underlying issue sort of at that subterranean level that needs to be addressed? And there are many different methods to inquire into this, so that appreciative inquiry might be one method where you ask questions. There are lots of different methods, and you referenced that These Darn Kids or Those Darn Kids paper. We've listed 4 different ones that would be really helpful if you're in a position of leadership and you want to create change. But it all really comes down to this idea of creating space for dialogue and civil discourse, and the need to create these spaces where friction can be discussed. It's not something that's scary. It's not something that needs to be personally attacking. where people can separate themselves from the issue and discuss the issue to figure out, well, how can we reduce the harm that people are experiencing? What does it take to do that? And really have genuine concern for each other, as opposed to just seeing this as, a disruption to the system and the oil tanker just plowing ahead, or the icebreaker just plowing ahead. We need to get out of that way of thinking and begin to take care of the people that are in our systems, or else we're not going to have a system. It's going to break. It's going to fall apart.
So actually that sort of comes back to the question, should one resist or not? So actually it's for the betterment of the entire medical system if you professionally resist where you safely can do so. Because it will then you will still give that system to the next generation, but a little bit better, I guess, than you received it.
Right, exactly. So this could be in the form of better treatment for trainees. It could be in the form for better treatment of patients, or a system that works better, or a process that's more equitable, or a practice that's actually based in science and not, in our case in the US, based on experiments done with slaves that have come to erroneous conclusions. But yes, the idea is to benefit the profession as a whole.
And then also, I guess the term professional resistance works on several levels.
Yes.
I've never really thought about that. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So a lot of things you also write about in your research, but we've also now talked about, reminds me a little bit of aviation. In the late 90s, 80s, 90s, there was quite a lot of plane crashes. There was a lot of psychologists analyzing it. And what they figured out was mostly cultural issues. Pilots not being able to speak up to the tower in a different country that they're actually running out of fuel. Planes crashing because of that, or the co-pilot not culturally being allowed to speak up to the pilot and saying we're on the wrong course. So it was just human factors. Most of these plane crashes happened because of human factors. And aviation completely turned it around. They introduced something called crew resource management, and many airlines now actually make the co-pilot, first or second officer, fly the plane, and the pilot is completely free to just double check everything. But I find it then interesting that we haven't done this in medicine yet. That we say the student leads this one, or the attending leads this one, and the senior specialist just plays a sort of supportive role. Is there a reason we're not doing that yet, or would this be a good idea in medicine?
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right, because we often say we want sort of self-driven, student-centered kinds of teaching, but we don't actually mean that. What we mean by that is self-directedness. But there is a lot in sort of experimenting, and I mean that in the way of like actually giving them some embodied experience so that they can practice with a supportive environment. It reminds me of Vygotsky. He was a developmental psychologist who died like in his 30s of tuberculosis. And he talked about the zone of proximal development. So you start out not knowing something, and then you come to rely on somebody else to teach you, and then you go to independent practice, and then sometimes you will forget. That's sort of like the last stage, and then you need to revert back to maybe asking somebody in the second stage, or just sort of having to figure it out on your own again. But there's an in-between stage, I've always thought, between 1 and 2, which is where you are talking through these different procedures or processes in your head. It's that voice that helps you make sense of something. And we don't leave a lot of room in medicine to be able to do that, to curate that voice, because we go from sort of not knowing how to do something to completely dependent on somebody else. And if we could just focus more on creating space for trainees to begin to practice talking through different things, I think that would be really helpful. So you typically see this in like the surgical realm, where residents and fellows are asked to talk through what they're doing. And that seems very much learner-centered to me. And then the attending surgeon is right there on hand to ask questions, to lead, to provide feedback. these kinds of things, but we don't do that elsewhere. And if we could find ways to do that, I think that that would be a really powerful way to transform medical education.
I completely agree. And by embodied experience, you mean sort of practical experience in the workplace, living through it.
Yeah. Experiential learning. Yeah.
And I guess that also teaches you about the dynamics of the workplace, the system at large, all the factors, because that's not something you can get from a book, right? You cannot cover this in a lecture.
No, you cannot. And also, I've observed simulations, and I've seen that medical students are really good if they're playing like the role of, say, a family member or a nurse or somebody else. But when they have to be the doctor, the physician, where everybody's looking to them to make decisions and they have to follow what everybody else is doing, they're not very good at it at first because they just haven't had that practice. They never get to own their decisions and own the care of their patients. And so when they're placed even in a simulated environment, they don't know what to do. And I think if we did a lot more of that kind of teaching where they're experiencing what it's like to be a physician in their training, I think that transition, particularly from undergraduate to residency, would be a lot smoother.
Yeah, so to invite the uncertainty actually, or to make the uncertainty explicit and play around with it and prepare one for all the uncertain decisions you will have to take for the rest of your life. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think making friends with uncertainty. I think we fear uncertainty because we're not put in positions where we can safely manage it, to think through it and make decisions around, how we're going to deal with it. But I think if we can make friends with uncertainty where it's less scary and something that becomes very facile, I think that would translate very well to clinical practice.
And I think that would also then really shape you in all your future uncertainties. And I think the earlier you probably have such a training, the better. The better you also understand situations. Because I feel like nowadays, many students, at least here, first you know very little, and then you sort of fake it until you make it approach. You just try to act like a physician, but sometimes, you just really don't know. But you have to sort of perform and keep some image up of yourself. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, and I'm not trying to say anything, but I think there might also be a dangerous aspect to that.
Yeah, I think medical students spend most of their time to manage the perceptions of others that they have of them. And if we could take that cognitive overload out, instead have trainees walk into the clinical environment from day one to say, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty here and I'm going to have to manage it. But I've tried this. I've trained for this. I can do it. That's a totally different approach to coming into a clinical environment. And I would imagine they could say to their superiors, I'm uncertain, I'm uncomfortable, or I'm comfortable saying I'm uncertain with this. I've thought of 3 different things and I'm not sure which one to decide. Can you help me pare them down? That's a totally different kind of a learning environment than what we do to our trainees now.
I wonder how different my grades would be if I was also graded on professional resistance and not if I do the socially acceptable things all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you, I guess, invite also students already to play around with professional resistance. And you also mentioned that everyone is slightly different, but that it is also an identity thing. And in your publication, To Serve My Community Better, you explore that identity formation of the resistor. So what does it mean for a student to truly become a resistor and not just act as one?
It's a continuum, basically. You can infuse it with your identity in ways that I have and others that I know have. It could also be something that you just put on when the situation requires it, and that's okay too. I think the more important thing is that you are aware of the kinds of things that need to be resisted. Like, what does social harm and injustice look like in these particular settings in which we work? Because without that awareness, and there are people who have not thought about that, then nothing is changed. One of the things that I wanted to mention about the resistor identity that we didn't talk about as much in that paper that I think is really salient is the emotional burden that comes with it. When you're resisting, you're constantly in a fight and everything feels like a threat. And that can be really unhealthy. And so resistors will burn out if they don't have a community in which they can sort of retreat back to and help them understand and recalibrate, get new tactics for innovation, these kinds of things. And so when you are resisting and you do have a resistor identity, finding that larger collective is critical. I think it's also critical for those faculty members who are supporting trainees who are resisting to create that community around themselves. So we're not talking about like traditional social movements where there was like a big collective and everybody was a part of it. I think in medicine, trainees have to create it and be agentic to find their own collective. And it's kind of a mix of different people. But faculty members need to encourage that because without that place to sort of rest their head, they'll burn out. And again, if you really want MedEd to change, as I do, so there's less social harm and injustice, they need these sort of safe spaces to retreat.
I couldn't agree more. Some people also have to resist more than others in the medical world. Some people might even need to resist simply just to make it through. What have you found in your research about that?
I found that the Black and African American communities and the indigenous communities in medical education, particularly in the United States, maybe Canada as well, so let's say North America, they have to resist simply to exist. They can't decide that they're not going to resist one day. And this is because the structure of medicine and the political structure of the United States and beyond has tried to eradicate them over time. And so these communities have no other choice. It's not something that they can try on for a day. It's baked into who they are. The only reason that these communities are still here with us is because they have resisted over time. And if they're going to stay in medicine and graduate as physicians, they're going to have to continue to resist. And so that's a very different kind of resistance than, say, me as a privileged white woman in North America, where I don't have this history of trying to be silenced and eradicated. And so I just want to bring up the point that resistance looks very different for different communities.
Yeah, what you described sounds like a workload I can't even imagine bearing, aside from maybe clinical responsibilities and education, but also just sort of having to fight for your livelihood. Yeah.
Yeah.
To summarize, what I've heard is most important to take away for students is that if they choose to professionally resist, which they should for the benefit of their patients and medical education in general, they should first of all have a proportional response. So the right amount, not too much, but also not too little. And it should also be sort of framed positively. They should propose a solution as well and not just say, look, it's bad. And ideally have a network or a collective to support them with ideas and sort of brainstorm together.
Yes, I would agree with all of that. I would also say they need faculty members that are on their side, working in the background, in the shadows to help them. So if you're going to create institutional change, it's very hard to do as a medical student. You need somebody in the administration who can help you frame issues, frame topics, to give you the inside information, to also go to bat for you if you get into a tight space, or sometimes clear the way for you to have conversations. And so you also need sort of the insiders working on your behalf.
And that's not always easy as a student to achieve, but it is great to have those individuals on your side. Is there anything else students should know? And if it's just a small act of resistance on the ward, so not about changing the curriculum, not quite as big?
For those who are not familiar with resistance, this has not been part of your identity or sort of your upbringing. You've never had to resist in the past. it can be very daunting to begin this kind of a practice. I would encourage you to start small. Just start with a question and try that on and see how it feels, and let it branch out from there. There's going to be plenty of time. There's no end to the amount of issues that need to be resisted. So while you're in training as the medical student, get comfortable just pushing back, even if it's just a little bit, because when you encounter clinical care, when you're in residency and fellowship, there's going to be a lot more to resist. And if you are not ready for it, it's going to overwhelm you. And so practice these skills now so that it becomes automatic and normalized for you when you get to the clinic.
Nice. And I think sometimes the little things or just being yourself is already enough, right? If the system demands extra things of you and doesn't really treat you as a human, then you just being human already sort of is resistance, right? That's what I sometimes have. If I just say, no, this is my limit, then that actually works quite well as well.
Yes, setting boundaries, telling people what you're able to do, not able to do in ways that are really authentic because you're trying to protect your energy or your time or whatever it is. Absolutely. That is a form of resistance.
And on the other side, I guess a curious approach, a supportive response. So rather than saying someone is or thinking someone is insubordinate, to invite them maybe for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and have a conversation about what's actually going on and trying to learn something about it.
Yes, absolutely. That is the role of leaders and faculty members. Your job is to think of your trainees as canaries in a coal mine. They're sending an alert. And so you need to follow them and find out what's going on and why they're resisting, because chances are they're rubbing up against something that's causing harm.
And if faculty members don't listen to the canaries in the coal mine,
then fire emerges, right? So the canaries often warned of danger. And so they flew out of the mines. And if you didn't pay attention to the canary, you would get crushed by the weight of the falling structure. And that's actually what's at risk by not following the trainees.
I think that's a wonderful metaphor to end on. Do you have maybe any last advice or wisdom for students who feel something's off but aren't quite sure how or if they should speak up?
I think if you have a feeling, you have perhaps maybe not even articulated it yet, just pay attention to it. Just that feeling alone is a part of you who's trying to get your attention. And so if you've never done this and you have no idea where to start, just sit with that feeling and try to put some words around it, because that feeling, that sense is going to grow louder and louder as you continue on with this practice. But if you can't be still and listen to it, it's going to be really hard to engage in these kinds of activities.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to chat to you, and I hope that the listeners have learned something about professional resistance and that they can apply it in their daily clinical or personal lives where needed.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun to talk about.